Shanghai, 1900. A park entrance. And a sign. Maybe real, maybe legend, but the Chinese believe it was there, that read, "No dogs or Chinese allowed." Whether that exact sign existed doesn't matter. What matters is this. China was so weak, so humiliated, so broken, that its own people believed a sign like that could exist on their own soil, in their own city, and they couldn't do anything about it. That's what Sick Man of Asia meant. Not just poor, not just behind, dying. A civilization that had led the world for 2,000 years, now so feeble that 8 foreign nations could invade simultaneously, burn the emperor's palace, and force China to pay for the privilege of being conquered. Here's what your history books skipped. That sick man didn't just recover, it plotted. For 75 years, China executed one of the most deliberate national transformations in human history. Not luck, not accident, a plan. You've watched most of it happen with your own eyes. When you were doing duck and cover drills in school, China was still recovering from famine. When Nixon landed in Beijing, China's economy was smaller than Italy's. When you watched the Hong Kong handover in '97, China was still a developing country. Now, second largest economy on Earth, largest military by personnel, more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined. The sick man of Asia became a superpower, and you witnessed the whole thing without realizing what you were seeing. Let me show you how it happened. The term sick man of Asia wasn't Chinese. It was borrowed. In the 1800s, Europeans called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe, a dying empire, too weak to survive, waiting to be carved up by stronger powers. By the early 1900s, that same diagnosis got applied to China. And honestly, the diagnosis was accurate. Look at China in 1900 through Western eyes. Here's a civilization that invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing, that had the world's largest economy for most of human history, that built the Great Wall and the Forbidden City. Now look at what it had become. The Qing dynasty was collapsing. The emperor was a figurehead. Regional warlords controlled more territory than the central government. Foreign powers had carved out concession zones in major cities, little colonies where Chinese law didn't apply. British parliamentary records from that era describe China as a dying empire awaiting partition. French diplomats wrote about dividing China the way they'd divided Africa. The question wasn't whether China would collapse. The question was who would get the pieces. And the Chinese knew it. Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary who would eventually overthrow the dynasty, used the term himself. "We are the sick man of Asia," he wrote. "We must cure ourselves or die." That's the starting point. A 4,000-year-old civilization reduced to a medical metaphor. A patient too weak to resist the doctors who are actually vultures. Let me give you the full medical chart. Because the sick man wasn't just unwell. He was dying from multiple organ failure. Military weakness. Terminal. The Opium Wars proved it first. Britain, one country fighting 6,000 miles from home, defeated China twice. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, ended with Britain taking Hong Kong and forcing open 5 ports. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, ended with British and French troops burning the Summer Palace, a complex larger than the Vatican, to the ground. Lord Elgin, the British commander who ordered the burning, wrote in his own letters that he did it to punish the emperor personally. 3,500 British soldiers spent 3 days destroying 200 buildings, looting treasures that now sit in museums from London to Paris. China couldn't stop them, couldn't even slow them down. Then came 1900, the Boxer Rebellion, and this time it wasn't just Britain. 8 nations invaded simultaneously: Britain, France, the United States, Germany, Russia, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. 50,000 foreign troops occupied Beijing. The Empress Dowager fled the capital dressed as a peasant. 8 nations against 1, and the 1 lost completely. Government dysfunction, critical. The Qing dynasty was Manchurian, not Han Chinese. After 250 years of rule, they were still seen as foreign occupiers by much of the population. The examination system that had produced competent bureaucrats for centuries was crumbling. Corruption was endemic. Reform attempts failed repeatedly. When the dynasty finally fell in 1911, what replaced it? Chaos. The Republic of China existed mostly on paper. Real power belonged to warlords who controlled their territories like medieval fiefdoms. Between 1916 and 1928, China had at least 1,300 different warlords. That's not a typo. 1,300. Economic collapse. Severe. Here's where the numbers get brutal. By 1900, China's share of global GDP had collapsed from roughly 33% in 1820 to under 10%. Let me translate that. In your great-great-grandparents' time, China produced 1/3 of everything made on Earth. By the time your grandparents were born, it had lost 2/3 of that position. The opium trade didn't just create addicts. Estimates range from 4 to 12 million by 1880, according to British parliamentary records and Harvard historian Julia Lovell. It drained silver out of China at a rate of $20 to $34 million annually. That silver drain collapsed local economies, destroyed the tax base, and made the government even weaker. Famines became regular. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people. That's more than World War I in one civil war. Social breakdown, profound. The humiliation wasn't just military or economic, it was psychological. Extraterritoriality meant foreigners couldn't be tried in Chinese courts for crimes committed in China. A British merchant could kill a Chinese worker and face a British judge, if he faced anyone at all. Concession zones in Shanghai, Tianjin, and other cities were governed by foreigners. Chinese people needed permission to enter certain areas of their own cities. The Boxer Protocol of 1901, the treaty ending the 8-nation invasion, demanded 450 million taels in silver. World Bank economists have calculated that's roughly $61 billion in today's money. China had to pay this over 39 years, with interest. The total eventually exceeded 1,300% of annual government revenue. And there was a clause most Westerners have never heard of. China was forbidden from importing weapons for 2 years. The victim was disarmed, so the attackers could feel safe. That's how sick the sick man was. Militarily helpless, governmentally paralyzed, economically drained, psychologically shattered. The diagnosis was accurate. The question was, could the patient survive? The first treatment was surgery, brutal surgery. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood at Tiananmen Gate and declared, The Chinese people have stood up. You probably heard that quote during the Cold War as communist propaganda. But here's what that moment actually meant to Chinese people. For the first time in 110 years, since the First Opium War, China had a government that controlled all of mainland China. No warlords, no foreign concessions, no extraterritoriality. One government, one country, one army that answered to that government. The surgery was removing the tumors: warlords, foreign influence, internal division. Unification achieved. Within a year, Mao's forces had pushed the nationalists to Taiwan, eliminated the last warlords, and established control from Manchuria to Tibet. For perspective, China had been divided for nearly 40 years. The surgery was fast. Foreign powers expelled. The concession zones were reclaimed. Foreign businesses were nationalized or expelled. The unequal treaties, all 23 of them, were declared void. For the first time since 1842, no foreign power held Chinese territory except Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. Then came Korea. In 1950, Chinese forces entered the Korean War against the United States and its UN allies. Whatever you think of that war politically, here's what mattered to China. The sick man had just fought the world's most powerful military to a standstill. American forces didn't reach the Chinese border. The UN didn't reunify Korea. Chinese casualties were massive. Estimates range from 180,000 to 400,000 dead. But China had done something it couldn't do in 1900. It had fought a major Western power and not lost. Early industrialization. Painful, but real. The 1950s brought Soviet-style industrialization, steel production, heavy machinery, the foundations of an industrial economy. It was inefficient, it was often brutal, but it was building something. Then came the disasters. The Great Leap Forward. 1958 to 1962 caused a famine that killed an estimated 15 to 45 million people, the deadliest famine in human history. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, destroyed institutions, persecuted intellectuals, and set back education by a decade. These weren't treatments. These were iatrogenic diseases, illnesses caused by the doctors themselves. But through all of it, one thing continued: the military buildup. Nuclear weapons, 1964. China tested its first atomic bomb on October 16, 1964. A hydrogen bomb followed in 1967. A satellite reached orbit in 1970. Think about that timeline, from sick man in 1900 to nuclear power in 1964. 64 years. When you were watching the Cuban Missile Crisis on television, China was testing nuclear weapons. The sick man now had the ultimate medicine, a nuclear deterrent that meant no one would ever invade China, way 8 nations had in 1900. By 1976, when Mao died, here's where China stood. Unified, nuclear-armed, still desperately poor, but no longer dying. The patient was stabilized. The long recovery could begin. Here's where the story changes completely, and this is the part you watched happen. Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978. He'd survived the Cultural Revolution. He'd been purged twice. He was 74 years old, and he had a plan. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, Deng said, as long as it catches mice. Translation: Ideology doesn't matter. Results matter. And results meant economic growth. The economic reforms, 1978 to 1992. Deng opened China to foreign investment. He created special economic zones where capitalism could operate. He told farmers they could sell surplus crops on the open market. He sent students to Western universities. Remember when Made in China started appearing on everything? That was Deng's plan. The numbers are staggering. World Bank data, not Chinese government claims, shows China's GDP went from $191 billion in 1980 to $1.2 trillion by 2000. That's a 6 times increase in 20 years. But here's what the raw numbers miss. 1980, China was still recovering from the Cultural Revolution. Universities had been closed for years. Scientists had been sent to farms. The starting point wasn't just low, it was artificially suppressed. The growth wasn't a miracle, it was a correction. Plus, something else. Relentless strategic focus on manufacturing exports. The export machine. You watched this happen without realizing it. In the 1980s, China exported textiles and toys, low-value, labor-intensive goods. By the 1990s, it was electronics. By 2000, it was becoming the factory floor for the entire world. Foreign companies came for cheap labor. China took the jobs. And the technology. Joint venture requirements meant Western companies had to partner with Chinese firms. Technology transfer agreements meant Chinese engineers learned how the products worked. Was this fair? Western companies thought they were exploiting cheap labor. China thought it was recovering stolen time. Both were right. Infrastructure building. Here's something that doesn't get enough attention. While China was building factories, it was also building infrastructure on a scale the West couldn't imagine. Roads, ports, power plants, telecommunications networks. In 1980, China had virtually no modern highways. By 2000, it had over 16,000 kilometers of expressway. For comparison, that's roughly equivalent to the entire U.S. interstate system, built in 20 years. This wasn't just economic development, this was military infrastructure. Every road that could carry cargo could carry troops. Every port that could handle containers could handle warships. The dual-use nature of this buildup wasn't accidental. Tiananmen, the turning point you misunderstood. You watched Tiananmen Square in June 1989. The protests, the crackdown, Tank Man. Western analysts predicted the Communist Party would fall. The Soviet Union was collapsing, democracy was spreading. Surely China would be next. They were wrong. The Chinese Communist Party drew a different lesson from Tiananmen. Economic reform works. Political reform destabilizes. The Soviet Union collapsed because it did both at once. China would do one without the other. 35 years later, the party is stronger than ever. China's economy is massive. West predictions about inevitable democratization look naive. I'm not saying the crackdown was right. I'm saying the West fundamentally misread what Tiananmen meant for China's trajectory. By 2000, the sick man wasn't sick anymore. He was healthy and getting stronger. And the West was about to let him into the global economic system. Remember the debate about China joining the WTO in 2001? The promises? Trade will bring democracy. Engagement will liberalize China. the middle class will demand political reform. How did that work out? China got access to global markets. It kept the Communist Party. And it executed maybe the most dramatic economic rise in human history. Second largest economy. Let me put this in perspective your generation can appreciate. When Nixon went to China in 1972, China's economy was smaller than Italy's. Today, it's larger than Japan, Germany, Britain, France, and Italy combined. IMF data shows China went from $1.2 trillion GDP in 2000 to $17.7 trillion by 2023. That's roughly a 15x increase in 23 years. The only economy larger is America's, and the gap is closing. World's largest military by personnel. China now has approximately 2 million active-duty military personnel, the largest standing army on Earth. It has the world's largest navy by ship count. It's building aircraft carriers. It has hypersonic missiles the Pentagon says it can't defend against. Remember, in 1900, 8 nations invaded with 50,000 troops, and China couldn't resist. Now, China has 2 million soldiers and nuclear weapons. Nobody's invading. Space program. China has landed rovers on Mars and the far side of the Moon. It operates its own space station, Tiangong, because the US banned it from the International Space Station. It has its own GPS alternative, Beidou, with global coverage. The sick man is in space. Tech leadership, 5G networks. Huawei leads globally despite US sanctions. Electric vehicles. Chinese companies like BYD now export worldwide. High-speed rail, over 40,000 kilometers, more than the rest of the world combined, built from zero, starting in 2008. Solar panels. China manufactures 80% of the world's supply. You watched the Beijing Olympics opening ceremony in 2008. Those 2008 drummers in perfect sync. That wasn't just a show, that was a message. We're not the sick man anymore. Poverty reduction. Here's a statistic that matters more than GDP. Between 1981 and 2015, according to World Bank data, China lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. 800 million. That's more than double the entire US population, more than all of Europe. In one generation, China took a population larger than North America and South America combined and gave them electricity, clean water, education, and housing. Western economists said it was impossible. They said authoritarianism couldn't deliver prosperity. The numbers say otherwise. Here's the transformation in a single frame. 1900, sick man of Asia, weak, dying, waiting to be colonized. 1950, Red China, communist threat, nuclear danger. 1972, potential market, billions of consumers, engagement opportunity. 2001, emerging economy, factory floor, cheap labor. 2008, rising power, Olympics, global presence. 2024, strategic competitor, rival, threat, peer. The labels track the transformation. And notice what they reveal about Western thinking. Every label describes China in relation to the West. What China means for us. What China threatens. What China offers. What the labels never capture is what China thinks about itself. A civilization recovering from 110 years of humiliation. A nation that remembers every treaty, every invasion, every burned palace. The labels changed because the power changed. But the memory? That stayed constant. You've watched this entire transformation with your own eyes. When you were young, Made in China was a joke about cheap plastic toys. Now it's on the phone in your pocket, the computer you're watching this on, the solar panels on your neighbor's roof. When you watched Nixon land in Beijing, China's economy was smaller than Italy's. When you watched the Hong Kong handover, China was still developing. When you watched the Beijing Olympics, China was emerging. It emerged, past tense. This isn't ancient history. This is why China builds military islands in the South China Sea. Because foreign navies once controlled Chinese waters. This is why China hoards semiconductors, because Western sanctions taught them dependence is dangerous. This is why the Communist Party tolerates no political opposition, because division nearly destroyed them. When you understand the wound, you understand the behavior. So here's the uncomfortable truth your government won't say. The sick man got better, and now he's stronger than the doctors who diagnosed him. The evidence? World Bank GDP figures, UN manufacturing statistics, Pentagon assessments. None of this is Chinese propaganda. This is Western data documenting a transformation Western analysts said couldn't happen. The world your grandchildren inherit will be shaped by a China that remembers everything the West did between 1839 and 1949. Every treaty, every invasion, every humiliation. They called China the sick man of Asia. A dying empire. A nation too weak to defend itself, too poor to modernize, too divided to resist 8 foreign armies. That sick man is now the world's second largest economy, with the largest military by personnel count, its own space station, and a memory that stretches back 110 years. The label changed because the reality transformed. The journey from sick man to superpower took 75 years. You watched most of it happen. The question isn't whether China rose. It rose. The question is, what does a country do with that power when it remembers exactly how it was treated when it was weak?